Welcome back to the Financial Chronicles channel. Imagine a world where ordering a cup of coffee costs 5,000 marks, but by the time you finish drinking it, the price has risen to 8,000. Imagine a world where grandmothers burn banknotes in their stove because money is cheaper than wood. And imagine a world where, in the midst of this total collapse, a few men are becoming the richest humans on the planet. This is not fiction. This is the story of Weimar Germany in the 1920 seconds. Most history books tell you about the misery of hyperinflation. They show you the wheelbarrows full of cash, but they rarely tell you the other side of the story of the inflation kings, the industrial tycoons who understood a dark secret. When money dies, debt becomes a weapon. To understand how this happened, we must go back to 1914. Before World War I, the German mark was one of the strongest currencies in the world. It was backed by gold. 1 mark was equal to 1 shilling or a quarter of a dollar. But when the war started, Germany made a fatal calculation. They believed the war would be short and they believed they would win. So, instead of raising taxes to pay for the war, they simply suspended the gold standard and turned on the printing press. The plan was simple. We will print money now to fight, and when we win, we will force the defeated allies to pay for it. But Germany didn't win. In 1918, they lost, and the bill came due. The Treaty of Versailles imposed massive reparations. Germany owed billions in gold marks to France and Britain. But Germany was bankrupt. They had no gold, they had a destroyed economy, and they had a fragile new government known as the Weimar Republic. Faced with riots in the streets and a mountain of debt, the government did the only thing they knew how to do. They kept the printing presses running. At first, it felt like a boom. While the rest of the world was in a recession in 1920 and 1921, Germany seemed to be partying. Because the currency was getting cheaper, German exports were incredibly cheap for foreigners to buy. Factories were humming. Unemployment was nearly zero. But this was a catastrophe boom. It was an illusion. In the shadows of this illusion, one man saw the future clearly. His name was Hugo Stinnes. Remember that name. He would become known as the inflation king. While the average German citizen was dutifully saving their money in bank accounts, believing that the government would fix things, Hugo Stinnes did the opposite. He understood that the mark was doomed. He realized that in an inflationary environment, cash is trash and debt is gold. Stinnes began a massive buying spree. He bought coal mines, he bought steel mills, he bought newspapers, hotels and shipping lines. But he didn't use his own money. He borrowed. He went to the banks and took out massive loans in German marks. The bankers, following old rules, gave him the money. Stinnes would take millions of marks in loans, buy a hard asset like a factory, and then wait. Here is the math of the magic trick. Imagine you borrow 1 million marks to buy a factory. The next year, inflation explodes. The value of the mark collapses by 90%. Suddenly, the factory is worth 10 million marks in paper money, but your debt is still fixed at 1 million. You can sell a tiny fraction of the factory's output, pay off the entire loan, and you own the factory for free. Effectively, the bank paid you to take the asset. Hugo Stinnes became the most hated and feared man in Germany. He owned nearly 20% of German industry. He controlled 4,500 companies. He was the first modern billionaire, created not by innovation, but by the destruction of a currency. But the game was just beginning. In 1922, the inflation was bad. But in 1923, the world would witness something that defied all logic. The moment when the curve went vertical, by late 1922, the German mark was sliding fast. But the final nail in the coffin arrived in January 1923. Germany fell behind on its reparation payments. In response, foreign troops marched in and occupied the Ruhr Valley. The Ruhr was the industrial heart of Germany. It was where the coal and steel lived. The German government, unable to fight back militarily, ordered the workers to engage in passive resistance. Essentially, they told the workers, "Go on strike, do not work for the occupiers, we will pay your wages." Think about that. The government was now paying millions of workers to produce nothing. Where did they get the money? They printed it, day and night. They didn't just have one printing press, they hired 130 private printing companies to help. Over 30 paper mills worked 24 hours a day just to provide the paper for the banknotes. This is when the hyperinflation entered its terminal phase. The velocity of money exploded. In January 1923, a dollar was worth 17,000 marks. By July, it was worth 350,000. By August, 4 million. By October, the numbers stopped making sense. Billions, trillions, quadrillions. Daily life became a surreal nightmare for the middle class. Prices rose not by the month, but by the hour. Workers were paid twice a day. They would rush out at lunchtime to buy bread because by dinner time, the price would have doubled. people carried money in laundry baskets. There are stories of a man who left a basket of money outside a store to check the window display, and when he looked back, someone had stolen the basket and dumped the money on the ground. The basket was worth more than the cash, but for the inflation kings like Hugo Stinnes, this was the harvest season. While the middle class saw their life savings wiped out, a lifetime of work reduced to the price of a postage stamp, the speculators were feasting. They engaged in what was called vlucht in die Sachwerte, the flight to real values. They bought anything tangible: real estate, art, diamonds, copper, lumber. Foreigners flocked to Berlin. Americans with a handful of dollars could buy entire city blocks. The Ritz Hotel in Berlin was filled with speculators popping champagne, while outside, desperate crowds fought for food. This wealth transfer was brutal. The middle class, the teachers, the civil servants, the pensioners who relied on fixed incomes were obliterated. They were the backbone of German stability, and they were being liquidated. But the industrialists, their debts were vaporized. Imagine owning a steel empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars and having your debt wiped out for the price of a newspaper. That is literally what happened. The loans they had taken out in 1920 or 1921 could now be paid off with a single banknote found in the gutter. It was a phenomenon known as the Cantillon effect on steroids. Those closest to the money printer, the government contractors, the banks, and the industrialists got the money first, before prices rose. By the time the money reached the average worker, it was worthless. Society began to break down. Farmers refused to sell food for paper marks. They wanted to barter: a pair of shoes for a sack of potatoes, a piano for a side of pork. The cities were hungry. The countryside was hoarding. Germany was on the brink of total social collapse. It was in this atmosphere of chaos, in November 1923, that a radical political group launched a failed attempt to seize power in Munich. They failed that day, but the misery of the hyperinflation planted the seeds of anger that would be harvested 10 years later. The system could not hold. Something had to change. The madness had to stop. But how do you stop a printing press that is spinning at the speed of light? How do you convince a population to trust money again, when money has become a joke? In November 1923, the exchange rate hit 4.2 trillion marks to $1. The currency was dead. The economy had reverted to the Stone Age. Enter Hjalmar Schacht, the newly appointed currency commissioner. He faced an impossible task. He had no gold, he had no foreign reserves, he had no credibility. So he created a fiction, a psychological trick. He introduced a new currency, the Rentenmark. Since Germany had no gold, Schacht said this new currency was backed by the land and industrial goods of Germany. Technically, this was meaningless. You couldn't actually trade a banknote for a piece of land. But the people were exhausted. They wanted to believe. Schacht strictly limited the supply of the Rentenmark. He stopped the government from printing money to pay its bills. He slashed government jobs. He raised taxes. He enacted brutal austerity. And, miraculously, it worked. The miracle of the Rentenmark. Prices stabilized overnight. The fever broke. The hyperinflation ended as quickly as it had begun. One Rentenmark was set equal to 1 trillion old paper marks. The zeros were deleted. But the stabilization brought a new shock: the liquidity crisis. During inflation, money was everywhere. Now money was scarce. This is where the story of our inflation kings takes a dramatic turn. Hugo Stinnes, the man who owned Germany, had built his empire on leverage. He needed constant inflation to pay his debts and keep his cash flow moving. When the printing press stopped, the music stopped. The flow of easy credit dried up. Stinnes' massive conglomerate, which was a chaotic web of unrelated businesses, began to crack. He didn't live to see the collapse. He died in 1924, just months after the stabilization, reportedly from exhaustion and stress. Within a year, his empire was broken up and sold off. The banks reclaimed the assets. However, the damage to society was permanent. The inflation profiteers may have lost some of their paper gains, but the real transfer of wealth had occurred. The middle class did not get their savings back. A grandmother who had saved 100,000 marks for her retirement, enough to buy a house in 1918, found that her savings account now contained nothing, not even enough to buy a cup of coffee. The psychological scar was deep. The German people lost faith in democracy. They lost faith in capitalism. They felt cheated by a rigged system that protected the debtors and the speculators while destroying the savers. This resentment is the true legacy of the Weimar hyperinflation. It wasn't just about economic numbers, it was a moral collapse. It taught a generation that following the rules was for fools, that saving money was stupid, that the only way to survive was to gamble, to speculate, and to be ruthless. It paved the way for extremism. When the Great Depression hit a few years later, the German middle class had no reserves left to weather the storm. They were desperate, and desperate people. Listen to dangerous leaders. So, what is the lesson for us today? The Weimar experience is the ultimate warning of what happens when a government tries to solve a debt problem with a printing press. It shows us that inflation is not a victimless crime, it is a tax that falls hardest on the poor and the middle class while enriching those who own assets and hold debt. We see echoes of this in our modern world. When central banks print trillions, stock markets rise, and real estate booms, while wages stagnate. The Hugo Stinnes of today are still playing the same game. Cash is for spending, debt is for leverage, and assets are the only lifeboat when the currency begins to sink. The billionaires of Weimar Germany danced on a volcano. Eventually, the volcano erupted. The zeros were deleted, but the history remains. A terrifying reminder of how quickly the money in your pocket can turn into dust. Thank you for watching this historical deep dive. If you want to understand more about the history of money and power, make sure to subscribe to the Financial Chronicles. History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes.